Hey, how's it going, guys? Bombadoo here. I've been doing some research recently, and it's been itching the back of my head about Activision and how their predatory marketing got the way it did. And it's kind of interesting after you do a little bit of research on Activision, all of their practices, not only recently, but the build up to make their current marketing practices possible. Now, before I begin, I have to have a little comment on hype culture, and I know I'm very tangential of a person. I go off on tangents all the time, but this tangent is going to be a little bit more controlled than my usual outbursts of different opinions, and I'll probably end up branching out like a tree in terms of hype culture, but that's what this tangent is going to be about. I can't talk about Activision without touching down on hype culture, because Activision, over the course of its career, has been pushing this hype culture. And in 2008 was when Activision merged with Blizzard. And every time a new World of Warcraft update came out, looking at this raw statistical data, it seemed that the populations came up. And at this point, I haven't played World of Warcraft, so I don't have an in-depth knowledge. I played RuneScape for most of 2005 to 2000, I'd say 13, 14. But it took me a while to figure out specifically what was going on with World of Warcraft, and I did some preliminary research on this topic and found some graphs and numbers just to, give me an idea of how this worked out, because there are only a few Activision games that I've played. Activision is responsible currently, its most well-known titles include Destiny, Call of Duty, and Guitar Hero. Now, I've played Call of Duty sparingly. I've always been a Halo player, which is under Bungie, and it used to be under Bungie, but I sparingly played Modern Warfare 2 back in the day. Now, that was my only exposure to Activision. My actual exposure to Activision right now that I can say is active is Destiny. So, how does hype culture play into Activision's rise? Well, it seems that back in the day, all of this new World of Warcraft expansion sort of thing, it took place after Activision merged with Blizzard. Now, Activision isn't making decisions with Blizzard because Blizzard is a separate studio, separate entity. They're not really, they are both under a group called Vivendi Holdings. Now, Vivendi Holdings has executives say they hold the shares of all these companies, so essentially Activision, Blizzard, and Sierra are all underneath this. They are all subsidiaries of this company, and Activision to this day is a subsidiary of Activision Blizzard. Same with Blizzard, the company is a subsidiary of Activision Blizzard. Activision Blizzard is actually a single entity that in of itself. So, how did they become so good at hype culture? Well, it seems that every time a World of Warcraft update came out, the population spiked. Now, this is definitely attributed to additional content bringing back old players, but from the raw numbers, I remember I was watching a podcast about this very thing. I think it was Unit Lost, back when I subscribed to them. It was about how there were millions of subscriptions, and then the millions of subscriptions just went back down after people got tired of the update. And it was just spiking activity, and it seemed that might be the, because you can't start taking advantage of hype culture. It's very difficult to gain a grasp or a foothold in the methods that Activision is currently employing. So they had to have a history of testing the sort of thing out, pushing certain buttons where, and even though it's a different community, it's still the same human psyche that they're working with. The kind of things that people respond to are the same or very similar. Because of this, hype culture can be harnessed as a weapon of marketing domination in terms of getting people worked up, and it's a fairly new thing. Hype culture has always been the sort of wild thing where it's only if you're 100% sure that something is going to be a good product. Like old video games that wouldn't be patched on release, there was definitely hype because the product, by necessity, had to be high quality when it released. So, going off of this, it can be said that modern hype culture still has the same sort of feeling to it because we're transitioning into a period where new games are consistently coming out incomplete or broken, especially new patches released by developing studios, which no knocking to them because modern technology is so expansive and powerful that people can now make older style games in their garage with relative ease over the course of years. For instance, Undertale was made by a group of a few people, by notably one developer who did most of the coding work and music all by himself, Toby Fox. Now, from that, you can now have individuals making these sort of big blockbuster games. How do you then translate your AAA game into something that can do better than that? Because now that the individual person can push that forward, you need to have a studio that can continuously keep adding to their product to make it constantly changing, constantly dynamic, to have a better experience for the players. How do you manage that? How do you get people on board? Because hype culture is different than it used to be. As I said before, hype culture used to be this wild thing that couldn't really be harnessed because it was this wild thing that could only be used in specific cases because a good product had to be released. Hype could be built up for a bad product, but it was harder to do that. You had to be really good at marketing. You had to have all these things behind the scenes. But now that studios and video game companies have built up their reputations, they can push that forward in terms of, yes, we've made these blockbuster games, now buy this one. And some could say that Destiny was essentially Bungie cashing out on their legacy because they made Halo. People were like, oh, Bungie made Halo, so they must their next game release must be something similar in quality to Halo or better. Because now we're in the future, it's all quality from here on out. It's on the Xbox 360, I played Destiny on it for a little bit, and then the Xbox One. But the initial game was extremely lacking, and a lot of people forget that the game hasn't really been complete. Even to this very day, there are still things missing from the base game. There are still areas that you can glitch into that are very strange, and some places were even environments were completely coded, made, completed with welcome messages and mechanics completely done. And you could just find them by glitching into them, and it was really weird how it was just put off, how this studio of really skilled and talented people could put this sort of content off when it was already demonstrated that in the base game this content was available. So, having to put this in perspective, when World of Warcraft's activity started going up, it was when the merger was completed in 2006 to 2007. 2007 to 2008 was when that merger happened. Now, they were still under Vivendi Holdings. Vivendi was still making all of the executive decisions in terms of the marketing. But Activision, Blizzard was in charge of that, and Blizzard was the specific studio. Now, it doesn't start taking a dip until 2013-2014, when things start going downhill, and that, ironically, is when Activision actually bought out Vivendi Holdings and became their own separate entity in charge of that, because Vivendi still had shares in Activision Blizzard, but Activision Blizzard was essentially, it bought out its parent company. Before this, there was also another game studio that had some very iconic names such as Crash Bandicoot and Spyro, which is Sierra Studios. They still, even under Vivendi Holdings, Sierra's products still had to meet Activision standards because Activision became the publisher. So these games had to meet the standard of Activision beforehand. So now you have a model that I haven't really discovered any recent Spyro or Crash Bandicoot games that I enjoy, but it seems like that's an early telltale sign of the type of company that Activision is. If something doesn't meet a certain threshold, then that's the threshold that they're going to expect that all of their future products meet. So, now that Sierra is out of the picture, you now have Activision Blizzard under Vivendi Holdings, and they are in charge of World of Warcraft as well as Call of Duty in 2013-2014, and this is when things start getting weird. We fast forward to 2015, and World of Warcraft is now essentially an Activision game, because the weird thing about Activision Blizzard is that it's still not using its own name to do things. Activision Blizzard is one entity in that and of itself, but even in the games that are run and published by this big company are still having their separate studios being credited for most of the work. For instance, you don't see Destiny as a Blizzard game, you don't see Destiny as an Activision Blizzard game, you see it as a Bungie game published by Activision. Just Activision. Even though the actual entity of Activision is merged with Blizzard and is an overarching company that takes advantage of other people with predatory marketing schemes, as demonstrated with the supply drops. You have the build-up and usage of hype culture to get more customers to essentially buy the product, and the product is subpar at release. For instance, Destiny was subpar at release, and you can't really be subpar with Call of Duty because it's all cookie cutter. The engine is outdated, but it's still very good for what people want it because it's predictable. People buy the game because it's an experience that's very constant. It's reliably going to be the same every time. The only differences you're going to get is then the gun variation, the mods, pretty much anything they decide to add to the game on top of the current engine that it's platformed on. Now that Activision owns this, most of this, and they're one entity with Blizzard because of the acquisition in 2007-2008, even the old Blizzard IPs, which is World of Warcraft, StarCraft 2, Diablo, they're all being tweaked in very odd ways, and it seems that World of Warcraft, ever since it was acquired by Activision and they merged together into a company, has been releasing a series of updates that don't seem to be really doing anything good. For instance, RuneScape has been a consistent experience even though the updates have been really bad, especially when they removed the wilderness. It was still the same game. You can still make bad decisions, but you don't have to continually release RuneScape, let's say God Wars Dungeon as its own separate game. RuneScape, The Wilderness Returns, separate game. It's not stuff like that. World of Warcraft, I believe, could have done that sort of model like most games do today. For instance, I play Warframe, and that is a continuous experience. There's no real expansion, quote-unquote, or DLC for that. Expansion sets and stuff is something that you do for older games. For instance, Blizzard's original game, StarCraft. It didn't go StarCraft, StarCraft 2, it went StarCraft Brood War, StarCraft 2. And the expansions were essentially their own standalone game. Brood War was an entire game, a completely new campaign, more units, redone sprites for all of the original content, rebalanced multiplayer. It was a game in and of itself. It was a continuation of just regular StarCraft. But you don't have that nowadays. Nowadays you simply have DLCs or in-game microtransactions, which I have already harped on in my last video. You can go back and watch that if you want to hear me talk about it for a good 20 minutes. Now, this is just a troubling sign to see going into the future about these IPs, because Activision hasn't been shrinking, it's only been growing. It acquired its parent company, and after doing that, it was in a place to make marketing decisions which ultimately would lead to the death of very, very well-known IPs, albeit slowly. I want to know your thoughts on this. Please leave them in the comments, shoot me a message. Please remember to like, comment, favorite, and subscribe, and I will see you in the next video. Have a great day.